Earlier this year, I played through a little game called Shin Megami Tensei 5 Vengeance. This is the usual enhanced re-release that Atlus does for most of their major games, though they claim that Vengeance is the last time they're doing it. It's got all the usual bells and whistles, new mechanics, quality of life changes, and of course a new re-release exclusive heroine in Yoko Hiromine. Initially posing as a student from another school, Yoko joins you on your journey through the Netherworld and ends up playing a pretty big role in the story. Whether her addition is a good thing or not is something we can talk about another time, but playing through the game, I kind of got the feeling that the way they handled her character was better than the way Persona 5 Royal handled its own re-release heroine. If you aren't familiar with the Persona games, or Shin Megami Tensei in general, Persona 5 Royal is the enhanced version of Persona 5, and like many Atlus re-releases of this nature, the new version came with some new characters, with special focus on Kasumi Yoshizawa, a talented gymnast who befriends the protagonist soon after he starts school. She was a big part of Royal's marketing, and in the opening sequence of the game, she's introduced with quite an impactful scene. That scene sparked a lot of intrigue about her character, at least for me, and due to most of Persona 5's story being told as a flashback, you're left with a lot of questions as to how Kasumi gets involved with the overall plot. However, after being reintroduced in the game proper, she soon recedes to the background while the main story of the original game runs its course. Her appearances are limited to a handful of short scenes scattered here and there, and considering that the original game scenario could run from roughly 80 to 100 hours depending on your pace, that's not a lot of time for a new character to make an impact. Her relevance in the story wouldn't return until essentially the end of the game, which was where all the new content was. It was only then that Kasumi became an actual part of the story and a major character in her own right. It's pretty clear Atlus did this because they didn't want to integrate Kasumi too deeply into the main story. They wanted people to be aware of her and realize that she was going to be important, but they didn't actually want to change the original story all that much. There's a chance that fans of the original story might find her inclusion obnoxious, so they probably figured it was better to keep it as is and just pepper in new scenes here and there to flesh Kasumi out. However, doing it that way made it really hard for Kasumi to maintain her relevance to the overall plot. Persona games are long on principle. It's not uncommon for a playthrough to take weeks, if not months. For most players, once you reach the point where it's finally time for Kasumi to take center stage, all of the momentum and impact of her initial appearance is essentially gone. I still like Kasumi as a character. I think her storyline is very compelling. It's probably one of the more interesting stories Persona has attempted. But her lack of presence makes her feel like something that's been tacked on rather than a natural addition to the story. Maybe it would have worked better in a shorter game, but in one of the longest JRPGs ever, I think it's fairly easy for some people to straight up forget that Kasumi even exists. If you're familiar at all with the franchise, you'll know that this is far from the only time that this has been a problem for the Persona games. If you've played Persona 4 Golden, you'll know that game also had a new character in Marie, and she was even less present in the story than Kasumi was. Unlike Kasumi, she was never playable, her social link was the only way to really interact with her, and she had no relevance in the story until the very end of the game. That swerve towards her sudden relevance was both unnatural and awkwardly paced, and fans nowadays are still divided in regards to her character's reception. As a result, fans have sort of started to dread the re-release characters that Atlus loves to shoehorn into these games, and even the best additions are often just begrudgingly appreciated. Vengeance, however, took on a different approach. I think Atlus realized that there was an issue with the way these characters were being implemented, and tried to do something different with Yoko Hiromine. Now, she was marketed as a major addition to the game like always, but along with her was news of a new story route called Canon of Vengeance, which would feature Yoko prominently. Story routes aren't new to the Shin Megami Tensei franchise, but usually those route splits happen near the end of the game and usually only affect the last few segments. Canon of Vengeance, however, starts splitting off from the original very early on, with the express purpose of creating a story where Yoko is the most important character. As a result, Yoko has a lot of presence in Canon of Vengeance's story. She joins your party relatively quickly, and she does not leave for a very long time. She is included in scenes where she was never present to begin with, and her interactions with others cause ripple effects through the story, changing it completely. Factor in all the other new characters, including the new Cadiz 2 enemies, and Canon of Vengeance is more than worth replaying the game to experience. The most important part of all this is that you get more time to learn about Yoko, to become invested in Yoko, to become interested in seeing where her story goes. You don't have to wait until you're done with the original main story to find out what her deal is. She's ever present and a constant part of the story, and while the two routes do seem to merge together after a certain point, her impact on the narrative remains intact, making her much more vital to the story of vengeance than Kasumi is to Royal. That's not to say that I don't have problems with Yoko. She's kind of wooden, and I do think that her personality is a little one-dimensional. However, there's no doubt that her presence in the story is stronger than Kasumi's was in Royal. And even though I like Kasumi more, her not being present for some of the story's most important moments really makes her feel inconsequential at times. It's such a waste, especially when Kasumi as a character could have been much more impactful if she had a bigger role early on. In saying this, I do understand that it's quite difficult for Persona 5 Royal to do what Vengeance did. Shin Megami Tensei 5 is dwarfed by Royal in terms of story content, cutscenes, and general playtime, so creating a new story route for that game just to include Kasumi and the other new characters would have been ludicrous. You could beat entire games in the time it would take to watch and read through all of Persona 5 Royal's cutscenes, and integrating a completely new character into those scenes, even if it's just to stand there and throw out a couple extra lines, would be a huge amount of effort on Atlus's part. I acknowledge that. Even so, I do wish Atlus would have tried anyway. I don't necessarily need them to add a whole entire story route, but having Kasumi become a bigger part of the story earlier than the literal end of the game would have gone a long way towards making her feel like a part of the main cast. She doesn't need to join the Phantom Thieves right away. In fact, she could have even worked against them as a rival, and at times I feel like they tried to hint as if that might have been the case. Yes, what she has in Royal now is great, but there's no denying that a version of the game that had her be more involved would have done wonders for her characterization. As I watch over those original ads about Persona 5 Royal and all the promotional videos made about Kasumi, I can't stop thinking about how much they tried to make her seem like she was going to play a bigger role in the story than she ultimately did. Even her intro in the flash-forward casino scene makes her look like she's going to be important, and her dialogue hints at possibly enticing story beats that ultimately lead to nothing special. For example, she mentions an important promise she made with Joker, which sounds like a really big deal, but ultimately turns out to just be a benign throwaway promise to do a New Year's shrine visit together. There's a lot of missed potential with Kasumi, and while I still think her overall execution in her particular arc was well done, she can't help but feel like a tacked-on afterthought outside of that. Compare that with Yoko, who might feel less established as a character, but makes up for it by being more present in the story. I like Kasumi more than I like Yoko. That's a fact. But it's also a fact that Yoko is handled much better and given more presence in Canon of Vengeance than Kasumi was in Royal. Yoko got more screen time, Yoko got more focus, and as a result, Yoko has more presence of character. And those are things that I wish Kasumi was able to have in her own game. The kind of character that she is, it's probably unlikely that we're ever going to see her again. Spin-offs like Dancing and Persona Quest 2 were released before she was even conceived, and Strikers and Tactica had to pretend she didn't exist. Considering that, it's unfortunate that she can't even have the spotlight in her own game, especially when you consider how hard she was sold to us. I'm not trying to sound like I know better than people who have created award-winning, best-selling JRPGs. By all means, they know more about the game development process than I do. Even so, it's a fact that I feel the loss of potential when I see Kasumi, and every time I see someone else go through the game, I'm always reminded of how quickly she recedes to the background. That's a shame for someone who was sort of billed as the poster girl of the game, and I wish she got a bit more attention on that front. Hopefully Yoko is a sign that similar characters will be given a little more care, and if Atlus keeps its promise to no longer do these re-release editions, Kasumi will probably end up being the last character to suffer this kind of treatment. Thanks for watching. I'm still getting the hang of making videos, so feel free to let me know if there's anything I could be doing better. If you like what I've made so far, consider subscribing if you want to catch when I put out more videos. Otherwise, have a good day.